Welcome back to the FANTI. We were just talking, Dr. Davis, about kind of how you got started, let's say, in this work, in this articulation around prison abolition. And we should say, right, that this episode is also part inspired by some of the feedback that we got from listeners to our two propaganda episodes that we did, which, had these, prison abolitionist folks, on it, talking about it. Dr. Loggins, like I mentioned before, we had Tia Oso, and then we also had Deshaun L. Harrison on the second episode. And we had a listener who emailed us and basically was like, in theory, I understand prison abolition, but they were speaking from their experience as a sexual assault survivor, as somebody who is neurodivergent, about how, if we abolish prisons, how we go about holding people accountable for whatever harms or violences may occur. And so I would like to start there, and go from there. How do you think about what accountability looks like in a world without prisons, and in theory also a world without police?
Yeah, I mean, this is, perhaps the most pressing and difficult question that those who, espouse to be politically committed to abolition are forced to reconcile with. And I think a couple of things are important. So one of the things that I didn't discuss, in addition to that initial comment that Aisha gave me, was being in community with organizers outside and beyond the academy, right? Like everyday people who are working on the front lines against these particular struggles, helped me think a lot about like possibilities for accountability, right? We often think of the movement in the public sphere as a place that is itself immune from these very things that happen, but we know to be true, right? That sexual violence also takes place in movement spaces, right? That harm also occurs, but often movements deal with those things very differently, right? In large part because, one, we don't trust the institutions that have said that they're going to actually instill accountability, but also that those very institutions perpetuate the exact same harms, right? We know that police, for example, are some of the number one perpetuators of intimate partner violence, of domestic violence, of sexual assault and sexual violence, even for those who have chosen to report and disclose, right, are often re-traumatized through the investigation process, are themselves additionally subjected, right, to sexual violence. So I think part of this is to think of abolition perhaps differently than is often misunderstood about what it actually is and what we're committing ourselves to. So one, we have to accept that neither police nor prisons have stopped, right, these types of things that have happened, right? And when we think about, crime more generally, and I put that in quotes in large part because, again, the state often determines what constitutes a crime and who is constituted as criminal. That is disproportionately folks that look like you and I, right? And when people of those institutions commit the same types of violences, there is very little accountability to be had. And at best, it's usually individualized, right? It's not a system being held. It's an individual officer maybe that we say is a bad apple. So if we know that these things are not themselves wholly preventative, right? They're not deterrents from people engaging in particular types of activities. We need to then limit how we understand their actual utility in stopping those forms of harm and violence. But I think also in the specific context of sexual assault, and this is not necessarily by any means an area in which I consider myself an expert. I would really encourage folks to read Erica Miner's work and Kamaria B. Porter's work at Penn State, Jessica Harris at UCLA, and other folks who are engaging in conversations around sexual violence. But part of this is recognizing that the survivor themselves usually is not offered much more than retribution. Right. And retribution that disconnects any level of survivor-centered care or healing that actually is most useful. And we have all the evidence to suggest that, again, that process, because we are so concerned about pursuing and putting in jail the perpetrator, doesn't really concern itself about the well-being of the survivor after the fact, right? What are the types of resources and supports that they need in order to ensure that they can live a full life absent of continued and perpetual trauma? Do they have access to what we call trauma-centered and survivor-centered care, right? Those who are thinking about the longstanding implications of what will need to happen, whether that's therapy or other forms of support. And this is often a part that's like not considered concern of the investigative process, right? We often don't even ask survivors, like, what would you want in this particular moment that would make better a situation that's obviously deeply harmful. And so In the same way, also policing is not preventative, right?
Mm.
Policing often comes after the fact that a harm or violence has already occurred, and largely as an investigative agent in order to pursue criminal charges and to put that person behind bars. And this is across multiple contexts. Obviously, my work is sort of grounded in education, but we see this in colleges and universities all the time, right? Who even have even greater separation because we go through a conduct process that isn't necessarily attached to criminal investigations. So I think we need to be raising the questions of like, who is this actually for, right? We know this is especially true for women of color, for trans and non-binary folks of color that are subject to sexual violence, that many of them are not first looking for police intervention, right? Or the criminal legal system to intervene, right? They need something that's actually going to help them along the way, which are not these particular apparatuses and institutions. And I think part of what gets missed in the conversation about abolition, right, is that it's not just about the abolition of prisons, jails, and police, right, to be sure. It's about ridding ourselves of a society that could have prisons, jails, and police, which is to say, when we think about this idea of safety, right, we're all socialized to believe that the presence of police is somehow about the same as the presence of safety. And we all Black here, and we know that that's not true. I feel the least safe when there's a police person in my proximity, right? But to say, well, what does it mean to create the preconditions that render us less vulnerable to harm and violence, right? What needs to happen on a college university campus and society more generally that would prevent men from perpetuating sexual violence, right? Which is the majority of folks who are engaging in this. What is it about how we socialize and develop young men to think about power, to think about control, to think about domination as a core part of their identity, right? And the sexual conquest also being tantamount to who they are as men that leads them often into perpetuating these types of violences. Right. So we are thinking of abolition as a process of reimagining, right? A process of thinking about society differently that does some of this preventative work, right? Preventative harm rather than retributive harm or retributive justice that tries to administer justice after the fact, when really the only justice that could be present is that sexual violence isn't happening, right? Not that we are able to criminalize and to punish and to detain someone who has actually perpetuated that form of violence.